Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots is what happens when fan service becomes a disservice. Here's why. Each MGS game up to this point has built off the backs of its predecessors, either mechanically or in design. Mechanically, MGS4 is a giant leap forward from MGS3. The controls were streamlined with over-the-shoulder gunplay, which still has lock-on options. Movement is sluggish, but it never feels like a hindrance, especially since crouch movement is a thing. There are better indicators for your grenades, so you actually know where they're landing. You have awesome new dodge mechanics in your rolls. The interrogation system makes obtaining items from guards a lot easier without risk of throat slitting. Crawling and maneuverability in general feels excellent, and best yet, both camo and stamina have been adjusted for the best. Octo Camo isn't just visually impressive 11 years later, but it's remarkably intuitive as well. Instead of digging through menus to change your camo pattern, you just stand still. Boom. And you still have disguises and bonus costumes like in MGS3 if you want them. Stamina has been replaced with a psych meter. The more stressed Snake gets, the faster it depletes. But after Act 2, you get a syringe that you can just inject whenever you start feeling stressed. So no more having to pause to eat noodles or Gophers or whatever. After Act 2 at least. Before you get the syringe, it's a fucking nightmare. Just like needing to use drugs to snipe properly, the whole stamina mechanic of Metal Gear has always been an annoying, invasive detriment. Never anything that improved the experience. But they eventually learned and ditched the mechanic entirely, and thank the stars above, it never came back. Never. Unfortunately, there's also Drebin Shop, which drags the game's balance behind the shed and shoots it in the face. Whatever you need, ammo, suppressors, whole new guns, just buy them from Drebin using Drebin points and you have immediate access. But the rate in which you earn DP is so rapid you'll never run out of ammo, which is kind of a problem when you have two guns that render every other gun completely useless. Fortunately, some of your gadgets are almost too fun not to use. The Mark II, for example, is completely superfluous, but god damn is it satisfying just rolling up to guys in the middle of a war zone and zapping them one by one. And given how MGS4 was the only Metal Gear game to really embrace ragdoll physics, using the oil drum to plow into guards is a barrel of fun. Yeah, pun intended, deal with it. Perhaps the true unique selling point of MGS4 is its inventive battlefield stealth system. You got a series of skirmishes taking place between the rebel forces and the PMCs, and with each battle you have tons of options. You can use the firefights as distractions while you sneak across the battlefield, or you can partake in the fighting, aiding the rebels so they can punch through the PMC's defenses. And the levels where each skirmish takes place have multiple routes from A to B. In one case, you have two completely different diverging outposts to sneak through depending on your mood, which gives these sequences tons of replay value. This is the part of MGS4 that's uniquely its own and where it truly shines. It's in the battlefield stealth sequences where you, the player, can get the most creative. And if MGS3 has taught us anything, it's in those hands-on sequences where MGS is running on all cylinders, which is why it's such a shame that the game ditches battlefield stealth completely in favor of dull, linear corridors and uninspired set pieces 2 acts into its 5-act game. That leads into the real problem with MGS4. Mechanically, it's top-notch, but its game design is ass backwards in every way. For starters, the level design makes it way too easy to just knock everyone out and just run from A to B. It's still pretty decent, but it's squandered either way because the guards pose no threat whatsoever. Guards are often on fixed routes that never deviate in ways that make you work to stay hidden, and even if you're caught, enemy soldiers have the self-preservation of a squirrel during rush hour traffic. In MGS2, guards had shields, rolled for cover, and on harder difficulties got pretty liberal with explosives. 7 years and 1 console upgrade later, and MGS4's guards all stand around in the open shooting aimlessly. They're stationary bullet fodder more suited for a Call of Duty game than Metal Gear, but MGS4 isn't fast-paced enough to make that kind of enemy work. As a result, action isn't exciting, and that's pretty problematic for a game that, like MGS1, ceases to be a stealth game for over half its runtime. Now, this could have been offset because enemies are still fun to dick around with in the stealth segments because of all your toys. Well, best get your money's worth early because from Act 3 on, your vast arsenal becomes completely useless. The first 2 acts of the game are the only real acts with any sort of actual consistent stealth action. Act 3 boils down to one tedious tailing mission that robs you of any organic exploration and sneaking in favor of following this whistling dipshit for 15 minutes straight. Then it's not 1 but 2 terrible rail shooters followed by a dull boss fight and an agonizingly long cutscene that serves as the climax instead of anything, gameplay related. Act 4 is more traditional stealth action at Decaying Shadow Moses, only the guards have been replaced with these evil bowling balls that not only pose zero threat but also render your toys useless. Geckos certainly shake things up, but they're not exactly hard to outrun. The best thing about Act 4 is that it has a lot more bosses than any act in the game. However, they're but moments compared to the collective whole of uninspired gameplay that takes place in really atmospheric settings. Finally, there's Act 5. 1 room with conventional stealth action, followed by a dull shootout, a dull boss fight, 2 narrow hallways full of nothing, button mashing, and a gimmicky final boss. There is zero consistency in MGS4's game design. Rather than do one thing really well, MGS4 does a bunch of things slapdash. It has brilliant ideas and mechanics, but we never get enough to be satisfied. The only thing MGS4 has a lot of is action, and it's mostly toothless, which conveniently leads into MGS4's boss fights, and nowhere does the phrase ass backwards more greatly apply. MGS4's bosses are backwards in both quality and quantity. Whereas MGS3 had 10 boss fights, almost all of which were excellent minus Shagohod, 4 only has 7, and while none of them are terrible, I'd never be in any hurry to replay a single one. They're either bullet sponges, gimmick fights, or completely restrictive. What made MGS3's boss fight so amazing wasn't just that they had a ton of different attacks and creativity, it was that you always had dozens of different strategies for taking each boss down. It meant that you could get creative with each encounter and fight them however you wanted. The only fight with an ounce of that creative freedom is Crying Wolf. You can either blast at her robotic shell or wait for Wolf to expose herself so you can attack her directly. This fight alone can be brutal and bombastic or slow and methodical, though it's undermined just a bit by how much more time is dealt with Frogs over Wolf herself. Again, none of these fights are bad. I can still squeeze fun out of even the worst fights of MGS4, which is more than I could say about MGS1. There is still creativity on display. In fact, these fights are the only instances where gunfights actually feel exciting thanks to how certain bosses get mileage out of the dodge mechanic. But most of the bosses, you're just shooting non-stop. Mantis is different, but like any gimmick fight, once you know the trick, it falls on the boss itself to be fun to fight. Psycho Mantis had a wide variety of attacks, and you still had options for fighting him head-on. Screaming Mantis, meanwhile, only has 2 attacks, neither of which are all that hard to evade. She relies on her puppets to keep the fight interesting, but that only holds up the first time around. Shoot the Sorrow to disable all her dead puppets, and shoot Mantis for disabling all her living puppets. And I know, what about Rex vs. Rayo, that epic final fight? Rock'em Sock'em Metal Gear is fine. Rex has a fair bit of weapons, and if all else fails, you can always just smash into Ray repeatedly. It's fun, cathartic, and light years better than the Shagohod or any of the boss fights in Peace Walker, though I get ahead of myself there. It's one of the best set pieces within the series, but if I'm honest, I still have more fun fighting the Pain than I did Ray, because that fight gives me what I love most out of MGS. I like smashing robots together just fine, but it's not what I dig when I play Metal Gear games. And as for the final fight with Liquid Ocelot, I'll be frank, I don't like that fight. Look, ideally, a final boss is supposed to put the skills you've amassed to the ultimate test. Not only does this fight deprive you of all your gear, but it uses completely different gameplay mechanics. It's like a poor man's brawler. You can sidestep, duck, gut punch, do a 3-hit combo over and over, and partake in slow QuickTime events. It might as well be a boss out of a completely different video game. And this is the finale, for God's sake. I mean, I get why this decision was made. Fist fights are more cinematic. And as Liquid's terrible final boss in MGS1 already showed, you can't make a fist fight fun with MGS's core in-game CQC combos. Here's the thing though. Why does the final boss fight have to be cinematic? CQC was always just one tool in your immense arsenal of weapons and options. In a lot of cases, you can go almost all campaign long without punching a single guard. MGS3 was the first game to let you keep all your toys and figure the final fight out for yourself. You can go all fight long without the boss ever even knowing your location. And if you went the CQC route, you either had to be really fast or blind the boss with smoke or flash grenades, which made it that much more satisfying to pull off. The boss is what a true final boss fight looks like. She puts every skill you have to the ultimate test and lets you use your full arsenal. All the strategies you've been using all game long, you can still use them against her. As a result, her fight is not only more satisfying, but infinitely more replayable and infinitely more enjoyable. When all you have is the same limited attacks, the fight becomes repetitive. That's always been the CQC boss fight problem of Metal Gear. It's better than an MGS1's fight because there are better dodge mechanics on display. But not only would a stealth action shootout with Ocelot feel like a proper final exam, I'd wager it'll probably be a little more fun too. But of course, game design and logistics don't matter. Fist fights are more cinematic and more emotional. MGS1 ended this way after all, so naturally instead of forging its own identity, what we got with MGS4 was yet another one-and-done gimmick. MGS4's best ideas get tossed out the window in favor of calling back to older games. It's as if the game itself is more interested in being MGS's best hits instead of forging its own unique identity. Instead, the focus is more on cutscenes and story, which is very unfortunate because this story might be the worst in the series. And considering one game actually featured this,
I live on through this arm!
That's saying something.
Diarrhea.
The premise is that just a few years after S3, the Patriots have created a brand new war economy. Everything is digitized, soldiers are all linked to a system called Sons of the Patriots, and Liquid Ocelot intends to hijack the system so it falls on Magnum PI to stop him. It's a straightforward, perfectly fine premise that, like MGS1, gets completely ruined by all the unnecessary bullshit. And that bullshit is the result of Kojima designing a story more focused on answering questions that didn't need asking and in excess of fan service. I've always said that Kojima has great ideas, but has no clue how to do those ideas justice. Partially because he's terrible at writing dialogue.
It was never going to work out for me. It even rained the day I was born.
but mostly because no one ever explained to Kojima that writing is about showing, not fucking telling.
Now we've got us a society where everybody's DNA and personal info is totally controlled by the nanomachines inside their bodies.
Your worm only managed to cut GW into little pieces. Pieces we were able to reconstruct. And then we stowed it away inside JD's network.
You'd need supreme authority from JD itself to control them. And they can be shut down remotely in case of an emergency.
Getting the obvious out of the way, there's about 4 or so hours of gameplay in MGS4 and about 8 hours of cutscenes. However, it's not that MGS4 is more movie than game that's the issue. It's that almost half of the cutscenes could be trimmed or else cut entirely, and not only would nothing be lost, but the story would actually be a lot better as a result. Take the opening, for example. Imagine how much more effective this would have been if it were in-game. No unskippable, unnecessary infomercials, no monologues, no overblown cutscenes, just gameplay with somber music. Geckos don't get introduced via cutscenes, they just show up and we know automatically to run away, and it falls on us to figure out how to escape, not having the escape resolved via cutscene. Then, instead of a 12-minute flashback, we get a call from Otacon telling us to go wherever. No mention of Liquid, Snake's age, or the system, just stay focused on the mission. When Drebin shows up, you cut out all the talk of the system and keep it sweet and to the point. When Meryl shows up, cut out explaining the system, cut out her Uncle Daddy issues, and cut out any mention of Liquid. Then, when we finally reach the PMC camp, make the section actually playable, and then reveal Liquid Ocelot when we reach our goal. There's a thing in writing called intrigue. It's when you leave audiences in the dark asking questions, but instead of spelling everything out, you let the journey speak for itself. We don't need constant monologues to explain the system or to reveal everything out the gate. A writer is supposed to trust that their audience will eventually get what's going on over time. Unraveling things gradually and organically over time makes for a far more satisfying storytelling experience than having the game sit players down and talk down their fucking throats. Like so many of MGS4's cutscenes are unbearably redundant. The scene at the graveyard is literally pointless. We're already gonna find out in Act 2 why Snake is aging, and we'll find out Liquid Ocelot is in the Middle East. We don't need to have these points spelled out for us. You don't show your hand on the flop. It's okay leaving audiences in the dark because eventually mysteries get resolved. This is what writers mean when they say less is more. By cutting out redundant bullshit, you keep the pace smoother, build intrigue, which in turn makes a story more engaging because you, the player, are asking questions. To make a larger point, part of why MGS4 has 8 hours of cutscenes isn't because there's 8 hours of story to tell. It's because MGS4 is loaded with unnecessary side plots that add absolutely nothing of value to the main plot. Meryl's Uncle Daddy issues, Raiden's issues with Rose, and of course, Old Snake's Foxdie dilemma. None of these 3 side plots needed to be in the game, nor should they have been. First of all, the need to trick the Patriots with fake weddings is bullshit. The Patriots are so omnipotent that they know all and see all at any given moment, but so incompetent that they can't stop one guy from undermining them at every turn. Second, none of these subplots are ever given enough screen time to make the payoffs feel genuinely earned. Meryl's issues with Campbell's Chunky Chicken get how many cutscenes? What, 2, 3? And all throughout the game, she stays constantly pissed at Campbell until she decides at the very end she's not anymore. Raiden constantly throws himself into suicidal situations until he decides to stop running for a bit. There's only ever a few scenes dedicated towards their angst. The payoffs are far too grand for stories that had so little screen time. None of this shit is earned. And finally with Old Snake, he's gonna die in 6 months already, so what does adding "oh, you're gonna become a living bioweapon soon" gonna add? It doesn't factor into the story one bit. It literally exists just to get that shot of Snake with a gun in his mouth, nothing more. And that scene only exists so Big Boss and Snake can have a big moment at the very end. There are hours of cutscenes that don't need to exist at all. While the stuff that should get focused on, like the war economy, the part of MGS4 that's actually very relevant to this day, is just a backdrop in service of fantasy bullshit about systems and nanomachines. And most of MGS4's cutscenes are aggressively boring because most of them are just these long, pointless exposition dumps. Like for real, who's sitting at home on the edge of their seat whenever someone's rambling about nanomachines for 9 minutes? Like real talk, is this the shit you missed when Fanpain decided, actually be a video game? Because that is what the majority of MGS4's cutscenes genuinely look like, folks. What few genuinely endearing moments MGS4 has tends to get snuffed out by a proverbial and literal ocean of verbal diarrhea. And if that wasn't bad enough, what MGS4 does with its cast is almost comical. Meryl, this whimpering melodramatic ball of nothing from MGS1 who barely had screen time, becomes this gruff badass who, despite betting everything on the system, gets her ass kicked at every turn. She also ends up marrying that terrorist she beat up in MGS1 who kept shitting himself. Sure, Raiden, whose horrific memories he already remembered by the end of MGS2, becomes Edgelord Grey Fox because more of his memories unveiled themselves off screen, and they were somehow worse than Saldus, making him a mass murderer at 10 years of age. Why not? Then there's fucking Naomi. One of the few genuinely developed characters of MGS1 becomes the most infuriating character Kojima has ever written. And that includes this fucker. Everything she says is pseudo-philosophical, pretentious dog shit.
If you won't be a prisoner to fate, then go. Fulfill your destiny. Neither of us can escape our fate. We are given life only so that we can atone for our sins. We wish to free the captured foxes. Our country is an innocent child once more.
She chooses to double-cross Snake and Otacon even though nothing was gained by the double-cross. She chooses to kill herself even though she could have still helped the good guys out to stop the bad guys. And she chooses to omit the truth about Snake's pointless fox-type bullshit, but has the time to tell Big Boss at some point and create a farewell video where she actually tells Snake he's earned his rest. And not, oh, by the way, don't kill yourself because you don't have fox die, dude. Naomi is either a brainwashed moron or an evil witch, and I sincerely doubt that was what Kojima intended. Then there's the whole love thing with Otacon and Naomi. Never is it ever established that these two had any kind of relationship off screen because presumably all this time Naomi was in jail before getting broken out. So they have one night together and then boom, all this melodramatic bullshit when she kills herself. Drebin's a cool character, but what does he actually add to the game? There's nothing he brings to the table that no one else could have already brought. You need a tank escape? Get Otacon into the mix. Or just don't have a tank chase. Campbell and Mei-Ling show up, but if both were cut from the game, nothing will be lost except pointless bullshit with Meryl and Raiden, and God forbid that should ever happen, right? Eva being Big Mama, who also happens to be Snake's surrogate mama, that's fine. What wasn't fine was her revealing the Patriots to be Big Boss's Kodak team from MGS3, which did nothing to establish these three as the monsters they've one day become. In fact, for a guy who built a crazy religion about the boss's will, there's nothing to indicate Zero even cared that much about the boss. This is literally so we can put a familiar face on the bad guys and pretend it's all connected, but it's not. Besides, did the Patriots need a face? Again, these are answers to questions that didn't need asking. Who founded the Patriots isn't nearly as important as how do we stop them. Instead, this is what we get. What's the point of MGS being serialized if each game rewrites the game that came before it? This entire Cold War between Big Boss and Zero, this is all off screen. Another possibly interesting story that never ever happens in the entirety of Metal Gear. And this is what everything's building towards, something we don't actually bear witness to?
Let it go, my son.
And if one scene perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with MGS4, it's Big Boss's return. This scene did not need to happen. It overcomplicates what could and should have been a straightforward story, subsequently deflating whatever weight the story held beforehand. And it exists just to point and say, look, Big Boss and Solid Snake together at last. This is what's all been building towards, except not really. This moment is pointless because Big Boss is here to tie up plot threads we didn't know existed until just now. What's the point in this virtual Cold War between two characters who weren't in the game, and if written out of the game, wouldn't change the plot one iota? It undermines the already flimsy story when you realize the entire journey was one giant smokescreen. There was no Liquid Ocelot in the end. It was just some guy with a chubby for Big Boss convincing himself that he was Big Boss's son. Look, can we as Metal Gear fans just agree that Liquid Ocelot was a stupid fucking idea? Explaining it away as self-induced hypnosis doesn't make it any less stupid. Just own your bullshit, Kojima, for fuck's sake. Making a simple plot something overly complicated at the home stretch doesn't do your story any favors. You're just making what's already a mess even messier. And it's all literally just to have these two together. It's pure fan service, only I hesitate to use the word service. It's a character we all assumed was dead, coming back to monologue about nanomachines and speak pseudo-philosophical nonsense for 28 minutes, then die immediately after. And this right here is literally the only reason the Fox Eye subplot exists. Like Meryl and Raiden, it barely gets any attention in the game and only comes up at the very end. I found almost every plot-heavy scene boring because most were just exposition dumps. Dress it up in cool music and concept art all you want. One-sided, dry info dumps are still dumps. Most of the character stuff I just found insufferable from all the melodrama. I'd rather a game not try to make me sad by having this swelling music playing over some asshole's 12-minute death and just give me a reason to give a shit when someone actually dies. And every single time there were genuinely cool moments, I found myself wishing I could play the shit I was actually watching. And you'll notice I'm not really getting into the specifics of MGS4's story and why it did or didn't work. That's because there's very little to actually critique. The broad strokes of the game boil down to a globe-trotting adventure to find Liquid Ocelot, where he's always 2 steps ahead and all attempts to best him end in terrible failure. Structurally, I have no complaints, but once you actually jump into the cutscenes, it's the same shit over and over.
System codes are the law now, and controls essentially absolute.
This data is monitored at HQ to enable command to make quicker, more precise, more rational decisions. The nanomachine network inside each unit member's body Lets us share each other's senses.
It's all handled by a massive, yet simple information processing system.
The U.S. converted its nuclear arsenal to reliable replacement warheads 2 years ago.
A massive cache of funds that would later provide the foundation for Zero's Patriots.
Enough! Enough!
What few elements of MGS4's story that could have had real intrigue are squandered. And of course I'm talking about the war economy shit here, the most relevant part of MGS4. The reason we don't have shit like universal healthcare has fuck all to do with preserving democracy or it being too expensive. The vast majority of developed countries have universal healthcare and they're doing just fine. You know what else these nations all have in common? They don't have nearly as inflated a military budget. As of 2015, we have spent over $1 trillion in our military, more than China and any other country on the planet. And this isn't going to American soldiers, this is going to defense contractors and weapons manufacturers. We might not have mooing robots that shit acid, but we do have an inflated budget within our American defense industry that sees us nearly going to war with other countries when unmanned multi-million-dollar military hardware gets shot down over a global pissing contest started by an orange bag of dog shit in an ill-fitting suit. This is the very war economy that Kojima's critiquing. We're living this shit. But nah, fuck all that. Armstrong?
Nanomachine, son.
That's what it's all about, folks. There are a couple of things I do like about MGS4's cutscenes and overall presentation. Old Snake might not be as cool as his younger self, but he's still witty, funny, and shows vulnerability, seeing as how every single act besides South America ends with him clinging to life. And in spite of that, he still comes back as a giant elderly dork each time.
Anybody got a smoke?
Snake.
Where are you going?
I'm gonna be spewing out poison soon enough anyway. What's one more smoke gonna hurt?
This is a no smoking flight.
Him constantly coming back for more and more, never losing his sense of humor, never ceasing to embarrass himself. It all works to make me love the old porn star. Otacon is the one and only character in the series whose growth feels real. We spend a lot of time with him across 3 games and you see just how much he's come around. His shit with Naomi might be some serious backpedaling, but we see that no matter what, he's always by his not husband's side and always willing to keep supporting him through thick and thicker. The villains are actually really entertaining in MGS4. Dumb as the very existence of Liquid Ocelot may be, he's actually a really good villain this time around. He has his stupid monologues, but coming from Patrick Zimmerman's mouth, it's kinda hilarious.
This is the liberty we've won for ourselves. Outer Haven. And with this weapon, I will destroy JD.
More importantly, he's a very proactive, very efficient villain. He's literally kicking everybody's shit in whenever he shows up. Like, I'd much prefer if this was just Ocelot. I mean, I'd much prefer a lot of things with MGS4, but as far as actual entertainment goes, Liquid Ocelot's one of the best villains in the series. He's like Volgan, except not a moron. In contrast to literally every other villain Kojima's ever written, Liquid Ocelot isn't being manipulated or undermined by anyone around him. For once and only once, we have a villain who's in absolute control. Even when he dies, he still more or less wins. There's nothing to vamp as a character, but as a henchman, he's great. He's really theatrical yet brutal. Phil Lamar gives a great performance because he's awesome, and he doesn't monologue. He just shows up and does cool or evil shit. That's exactly what I want from a lower level MGS villain. Someone who's ridiculously flamboyant but oddly badass and fun to watch. It's just too bad that his death scene had to be more melodramatic garbage, because Slash to the Jest really was the perfect way for this evil monster to go out. And while I don't like most characters, the voice acting is probably the best in the series outside of Phantom Pain.
I was being attacked by Frank Yeager.
Yeah, I remember.
If you hadn't shown up when you did, gives me the shivers just thinking about it.
Many have called MGS4's soundtrack generic since series composer Norihiko Hibino left the series after Portable Ops. In his place were the composers from the Metal Gear Acid games, namely Akihiro Honda, Nobuko Toda, and Shuji Kobori. And sure, compared to MGS3 it is an immense downgrade, since without Hibino that distinct Eastern flair he brought which gave the series immediate distinction is gone. So too is that timeless Metal Gear theme due to claims that it was ripped off of an old Russian composition, Winter Road. I know the crew said it was just a coincidence. All I'm saying is War Has Changed, which is from MGS4 Another Side, sounds a little familiar.
following takes place between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. on the day of the California presidential primary.
But that said, Guns of the Patriots really does have a really good soundtrack. The cutscene music does sound way too melodramatic for my taste, and some themes do feel a bit more Hollywood, but then you got tracks like this. I think there's a lot of really good in-game music in MGS4, things to fit the feel of certain set pieces, evasion themes, and especially the boss themes, which I've yet to hear a single bad Metal Gear boss theme. Honestly, I love Toda and Kobori's work on Metal Gear Acid. That was one of my favorite soundtracks in honestly all of gaming. And Honda did excellent work on Metal Gear Acid 2 and The Phantom Pain. Less so on Metal Gear Survive, but that's a topic for another day. Seriously, for all the shit this soundtrack has gotten from your Super Bunny Men or people on Reddit, guarantee even those people will agree that the score still sticks out to you more than 90% of video game music released then and now. In fact, the sound design in general is fucking aces in MGS4. Every gun just sounds meaty and heavy, making it that much more satisfying to shoot. The overall production value of MGS4 is cream of the crop as well. Like, to this day, its graphics are fantastic, and I defy any of the 2 people still watching this video to cite a single fight scene in any video game as well choreographed as Snake vs. Ocelot. Even the fights between Raiden and Vamp, over the top and idiotic as they may be at points, are just fucking awesome. MGS4 may seem cynical in its quest to answer all these stupid fucking questions and usually answers them with nanomachines or some shit, but this game really was a labor of love. Like, you really don't put this much effort into a video game if you're phoning it in. And as I was replaying this game, it really is hard not to feel and appreciate that effort. You get a sense that there was true passion and drive to make something grand, and hey, for a lot of people, it really was. I've been going to the same game spot for over a decade, and I still see this dirty old bastard's mustache smiling down upon me. It's just that for all the effort in the world, there's really no accounting for the simple things in gaming. Things like consistent game design, streamlined, straightforward stories with dialogue that don't make me want to die violently. There is so much that is good about MGS4 that I almost feel bad for not enjoying it, but I don't. The strength of each individual game comes not from the title or the effort or the love that went into each game, but how much incentive that effort provides me to come back for more after the credits have already rolled. That's how I ultimately rate, well, everything really, based on both its core strength and how much I will actively want to come back for more. And while MGS4 is never as painful as, say, going back and forth to warm up a PAL card, unfortunately for all its strength, it just feels like such a downgrade from MGS2 and 3. It controls better, looks shinier, and feels way more intuitive, but nothing about it is ever as fun to play as its predecessors. Not its boss fights, its set pieces, its moment-to-moment gameplay, nothing. It has about as much gameplay as any MGS game besides the Phantom Pain, but the key difference between 4 hours of MGS4 and 4 hours of MGS3 is that with 1, there's consistent game design on display. MGS3 gets muddled by its terrible set pieces towards the end, but for about 80% of those 4 hours, you're getting consistent, clever, and replayable stealth action paired up with some of the finest boss fights in all of gaming. MGS4 has consistency in its first 2 acts, and at its best creates really enjoyable gameplay loops. But from Act 3 on, all consistency goes out the window. And from there, the rest of the game is a mishmash of set pieces, railroaded linearity, entirely different guard types, and boss fights that range from bullet sponges to novelties and gimmicks. The first 2 acts are MGS4 at its best. But whereas you get your money's worth with MGS3, you don't really get that with MGS4. And what many inconsistent elements that get tossed into the mix aren't nearly as fun as what you had to work with in the Middle East and South America. So what incentive do I really have to come back to a video game that I know becomes infinitely less enjoyable less than halfway in? Even with its trite, fan-service-ridden storyline, I truly believe there is a masterpiece buried somewhere within MGS4. The mechanics are there, the potential for good level design and fun gameplay loops are there as well, but this is a game that was ultimately kneecapped by being so unfocused. As opposed to doing one thing really well like MGS3 mostly did, MGS4 is a jack of all trades but a master of none. And so my final rating of MGS4 is a 6 out of 10. Like MGS1, I can see the appeal and I can even see those fleeting moments of brilliance. But also like MGS1, the enjoyment peaks far too early and the rest of the ride just nosedives in terms of fun. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm sure many disagree and have those thumbs down ready, but I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video anyway. Whatever your thoughts, let me know in the comments. If you thought this review wasn't complete dog shit, maybe consider subscribing. Anyway, thanks for watching, and wait. I almost forgot to mention Metal Gear Online 2, the short-lived multiplayer component of MGS4. Metal Gear Online 2 was a giant piece of shit.